He came prepared to humiliate her on live television, but by the time Karoline Leavitt was done, the entire studio sat in stunned silence. Karoline wasn't new to interviews. She had faced tough questions before, handled hostile debates, and stood her ground in conversations designed to shake her. But something about this one felt different. She first heard about the interview a week ago, an invitation from a high-profile news program known for its confrontational style. Not just any program, but the kind where guests weren't just questioned but cornered, where the host, a seasoned journalist with decades in the industry, had a reputation for belittling younger guests, especially those who didn't fit his worldview. Karoline had done her research. The journalist, Richard Caldwell, was a veteran in the industry. He had built his career on his sharp tongue and his ability to expose guests who, in his eyes, weren't qualified to sit across from him. His strategy was simple: provoke, discredit, and, if necessary, humiliate. It wasn't about conversation, it was about control, and tonight, Karoline was his target. She could already hear the criticisms before even stepping into the studio: too young, too inexperienced, too ambitious for her own good. The labels didn't bother her. What did was the arrogance of men like Caldwell, who thought they could rattle her with a smirk and a raised eyebrow. The moment she arrived at the studio, she felt it, the unspoken condescension. The producer, a man in his mid-50s, greeted her with a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The assistant, a younger woman, offered a hesitant nod but avoided eye contact. It was the kind of atmosphere that made one thing clear: she wasn't expected to win this exchange. But Karoline wasn't here to play by their expectations. She sat in the makeup chair, barely listening as the stylist brushed powder over her face. The murmur of voices from the adjacent set filtered through the walls. She could hear Caldwell's distinct voice wrapping up his current segment, his tone measured, confident, the voice of a man who had spent years controlling the conversation. The stylist adjusted the collar of Karoline's blazer. "You ready?" Karoline met her reflection in the mirror. She didn't need to answer. Minutes later, she was led into the studio. The lights were blinding, the air-conditioned room unnaturally cold. The audience, composed mostly of journalists and industry insiders, was seated just beyond the cameras, silent, waiting. Caldwell was already in his chair, legs crossed, a practiced smile on his face, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to welcome but to challenge. His fingers drummed against the desk as she took her seat. "Karoline Leavitt," he said, stretching out her name as if tasting it for the first time, "welcome to the show." She nodded. "Thanks for having me." His eyes flickered, scanning her as if assessing how much resistance she'd put up. He leaned forward slightly, his smirk barely concealed. "You've made quite a name for yourself in a short time. Some might say too fast for someone with so little experience." Karoline held his gaze. She had expected this, the veiled insult disguised as an observation, the attempt to plant doubt from the very first sentence. "I think experience comes from action, not just years," she said evenly. Caldwell let out a short laugh, shaking his head slightly, as if amused. "Ah, but isn't that what every young upstart says before realizing they're in over their head?" There it was, the first attempt to make her shrink, to make her second-guess herself. Karoline didn't blink, but Caldwell wasn't finished. He tilted his head, fingers tapping the desk in mock curiosity. "I have to ask, though, do you really believe you've earned a seat at this table, or is this just another case of someone trying to skip the hard work and go straight for the spotlight?" The air in the studio shifted. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a battle. But Karoline had never been one to back down from a fight. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes locked onto Karoline like a predator sizing up its prey. The studio felt colder now, the tension thick enough to cut through. Karoline knew this tactic: establish dominance early, make the guest feel like they're defending themselves from the start. But she wasn't here to play defense. She adjusted her posture, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I don't believe success has a set timeline," she said. "If someone is competent, driven, and prepared, why should they have to wait their turn?" Caldwell smirked, shaking his head slightly. "That's the thing about younger generations, always in a rush. You talk about preparation, but let's be honest, experience matters. And frankly, many would argue that you haven't paid your dues." Karoline could hear the faint chuckle from someone off camera, probably a producer. They were expecting her to stumble. She didn't. "I think the idea of paying dues is often used to keep people in their place," she said. "What exactly are we talking about? a waiting period, an arbitrary number of years before someone's opinion is valid. Because I don't think the world works that way anymore. Caldwell's smirk twitched. He had expected a rehearsed response, something polished but predictable. Instead, she had given him something he couldn't immediately dismiss. He shifted in his chair. That sounds convenient, he said, his tone laced with condescension. But let's be real, people don't just wake up one morning and suddenly deserve a platform. It takes time, hard work, and, frankly, wisdom that comes with age. Karoline let a brief silence pass before responding, not long enough to be awkward, but just enough to let his words settle. Wisdom comes from experience, she said. But experience isn't just about age, it's about what you do with the opportunities you have. Some people spend decades in a field and never push beyond the surface. Others come in and, through sheer work ethic, insight, and innovation, make an impact almost immediately.